The rain had stopped hours ago, but the sand still held its weight. Along the highway stretching past Roswell, the blackness of night lay heavy, broken only by the occasional flicker of a dying street lamp or the distant hum of a telephone wire. It was in this damp, moonless silence that Sheriff Vernon Brower pulled his truck over near mile marker 42, summoned by a call from a local rancher who claimed something had fallen from the sky. Vernon wasn't a man prone to fantasy. A veteran of the Pacific, he had seen too much to believe in ghost stories or little green men. But what he found that morning of the 5th of July, year 1947, on the barren Foster land shook even his hardened nerves. The debris field stretched over 200 meters. Scattered across it were shards of material unlike any he'd seen. Thin, metallic, weightless, yet impossible to bend or tear. Embedded in the sand was a burnt circle, blackened like charcoal, no more than 12 meters across. The rancher, Mac Travers, a man in his 60s with sun-leathered skin, stood at a distance, arms crossed tightly, unwilling to step near the field again. "There was a noise," he said hoarsely, "a screeching, like metal being torn underwater, then nothing. But something's wrong out there." Within hours, men in uniform, but not standard army, arrived. No insignia, no names. They took photographs, measured distances, picked up every fragment. Vernon was ordered to remain behind the fence line. He did not protest, not yet. By the following evening, the story was already shifting. The Roswell Daily Record printed that the military had recovered a flying disc, only to retract the statement within a day, claiming it was a weather balloon. But Vernon knew what he saw, and it was no balloon. It had weight, not in mass, but in presence. And then, 3 days after the initial report, Mac Travers vanished. The sheriff was the last to see him. They spoke briefly outside the courthouse, where Max said he was thinking of heading to Capitan to stay with a cousin. But he never arrived. No bags packed, no sign of struggle. His truck remained in his driveway, key still in the ignition, the front door unlocked, 2 cups of cold coffee on the table. It wasn't just Travers. A waitress named Eleanor Weiss, who worked the early shift at Clark's Diner and had reportedly served coffee to 2 unnamed men in dark coats discussing containment 2 nights after the crash, failed to show for her shift. Her brother filed a missing persons report a week later. Her home was untouched, her dog unfed, her car still parked outside. Stranger still were the documents found in the county archive. Vernon, increasingly disturbed by the oddities, began keeping his own record, typed carefully on a royal typewriter and hidden beneath a floorboard in his office. One entry stood out. July 12th, local civil engineer, name redacted, delivered copy of photograph taken near Second Ridge. Image depicts second impact site. Material different from first, more intact. Noted heat warping and indented surface, similar to blast cavity. Civilian told not to return. Warned he might face charges of trespassing on federal site. Engineer now refuses to speak, claims he saw too much. No such site was ever officially acknowledged. There were no further mentions of it in the press. Yet a faded blueprint of the area, obtained years later from a retired draftsman, showed something peculiar. A section cordoned off with the label Industrial Reserve ZT3. When Vernon asked about it at the county meeting, the room went cold. Councilman Harding stared at him a full 10 seconds before saying, "That designation's been phased out. Nothing there now." But something had been there. In early August, a former communications technician, David Lunt, returned from his stationing in Alamo Gordo. He and Vernon had served together. Over beers one night, David broke silence. "We intercepted signals that week," he said, barely audible. "Not radio, not Morse, pulses, patterned, repeating, but not in any known code. Then, static. I sent it up the chain, and they told me to forget I'd heard it. 3 days later, my superior, Major Galloway, was gone. Transferred, they said, but his office was cleared out by midnight. Lunt, trembling, pushed a slip of paper across the table. It was a transcribed fragment, handwritten. It read, 47-G. Object stationary, signal continuous, repeating structure evident, possible operator inside, priority red. By the second week of August, Vernon began to feel the quietness tighten. Mail was late or tampered with. Phone clicks echoed faintly during calls. His request for a formal investigation into Trevors's disappearance was denied on the grounds of insufficient evidence. When he inquired at the local base, an officer he'd known for years responded coldly, "Sheriff, some things are best left buried." But Vernon Brower was not the kind of man to bury truth. He started meeting with other veterans, mostly in secret, men who'd been stationed near Roswell or worked logistics during the July transfer operations. From them, a second narrative began to form, not just one object, but two. The second, more intact, was moved under cover of night, escorted not by military personnel, but by contractors from a company none of the men recognized. Their trucks bore no logos, their men carried no rank, and they were accompanied by scientists, not in uniform, speaking in clipped northern accents. That autumn, reports began to spread of strange deaths, heart failure in young men, sudden illness in those who had touched the wreckage. A farmhand in Dexter, who'd briefly stored one of the metallic shards in his shed before surrendering it, was found collapsed in a field. Autopsy inconclusive. A teenager who witnessed the removal of a crate from the foster site suffered seizures for the first time in his life. The local doctor dismissed it as coincidence. By October, Vernon's notes had grown from a drawer to a locked filing cabinet. He had lists of names, cross-referenced by dates and locations. A hand-drawn map of the crash site and the second rumored location near the ridge. Sketches of the metallic material. Copies of newspaper clippings and missing persons flyers. But what haunted him most was the final photo taken by Mac Travers, recovered from his camera, which had been left behind in the barn. It showed a man standing at the edge of the debris field. His figure blurred, but tall, too tall and thin, with arms strangely long and slightly bent outward, as if not accustomed to his own weight. And behind him, half buried in sand, a sphere no wider than 2 meters, partially cracked open. Through the fracture, something black, glistening and uneven reflected the flash. The negative disappeared from the archive a week after it was entered into evidence. And then Vernon Brower stopped writing. His last note, dated October 19th, read simply, "They are not done." The wind that tore across the high plains of New Mexico in November of 1947 came colder than usual. It howled low across the scrublands, whistling through broken window panes in the outskirts of Roswell, echoing like voices that refused to die. By then, the town had changed, subtly, but undeniably. The air carried a strange weight. Conversations were quieter. People looked over their shoulders more often. Something unsaid had settled over the streets. In early November, at a decommissioned grain warehouse west of the Chaves County line, a meeting was held. Late at night, unannounced, lights dimmed. Among those gathered were 2 former Air Force engineers, a retired geologist who had worked on the Alamogordo test range, and a man who identified himself only as Reeves. He wore a gray suit, carried no identification, and never gave a first name. They spoke in low voices over folded maps and carbon-copied reports. Reeves laid out a document marked Transit Report, July 9th. It referenced a convoy that had left Roswell under military escort but was diverted 80 kilometers east of its intended route. The cargo was listed only as organic volatile, non-native, E-class. Reeves said nothing at first, letting the others read. The engineer, Stephen Garrison, lit a cigarette with trembling hands. He had worked radar installations in the desert during that summer. His voice was steady, but his eyes avoided contact. "We tracked something descending. First blip appeared around 200 kilometers out. It was moving too slow for a meteor, then it vanished, reappeared minutes later, much closer, almost like it skipped." "What do you mean, skipped?" asked the geologist. Garrison hesitated. Like it touched down and lifted off again. What followed was a retelling of a second incident, one that had remained out of the public eye. On the morning of July 8th, a separate crash site had been reported near Pine Ridge, a barren stretch where the earth rolled open into low hills. A patrol unit was dispatched, but by the time they arrived, the site had already been sealed off. Not by military personnel, but by a private security detachment wearing black jackets, driving unmarked vehicles, and reporting to no known command. The geologist, Paul Richter, had been hired weeks later to examine the land. Officially, he was told to assess damage from an alleged ordnance misfire. But when he arrived, what he found defied that narrative. There were scorch marks, he said, but no impact crater, no fragmentation. Instead, there were imprints, circular. 4 of them, spaced evenly, as if something had lowered itself gently, like legs of a tower. But it was too clean. And the soil composition. He paused, then drew out a small vial the size of a thimble, wrapped in cloth. Inside was sand, but not like ordinary desert sand. It shimmered faintly, with a silvery hue. This isn't native. It reacts to magnetic fields. We tested it. The grains align themselves when current is applied. I've seen nothing like it. Reeves reached for the vial, but Richter recoiled. No, he said. I'm not letting it out of my hands again, not after what happened to Palmer. Palmer had been Richter's assistant. 2 weeks after handling samples taken from the site, he developed severe lesions on his hands. Internal bleeding followed. His death certificate cited acute systemic failure with unknown origin. The hospital records were sealed. That winter, others began speaking. In El Paso, a mechanic named Tom Belknap reported a chance encounter with a military convoy that stopped at his station after midnight on July 10th. One of the trucks had broken down. Inside the covered flatbed, he glimpsed what he described as a coffin-shaped container, metallic, with cables running into it from an external generator. I heard a humming, he said, like an engine running inside something alive. He was warned not to speak. A week later, his shop burned down under mysterious circumstances. Arson was suspected. No charges were filed. Meanwhile, in Roswell, a schoolteacher named Margaret Dorsey found herself the custodian of a secret she never sought. Her younger brother, Clyde, had worked briefly at the Roswell Army Airfield as a janitor. After the incident, he returned home pale, sickly, and mute. He never spoke again. Margaret found a bundle of sketches in his trunk, crude drawings of figures, tall and gaunt, with dark almond-shaped eyes, standing inside what appeared to be a half-open sphere. One drawing showed the figures bending over a prone human form. Margaret handed the drawings to a traveling reporter who had come asking questions in late November. The reporter, Clarence Holt, vanished en route to Albuquerque. His last telegram, sent from a roadside station near Vaux, read only, "I'm followed. Material too dangerous. Tell them it's not over." His body was never found. Back at the grain warehouse, the former servicemen continued their unofficial inquiry. Reeves laid out a map with several red dots, locations where civilian sightings had occurred between July 5th and July 11th. None of these had been included in official reports. 2 of them, near Corona and another near Encino, aligned precisely with elevated readings of background radiation, confirmed independently by Paul Richter's instruments. One of the engineers leaned over the map and muttered, "This isn't one crash, it's a corridor. Something came through, in pieces maybe, or something was looking for something." A theory emerged that night, one never submitted in writing. What crashed outside Roswell may not have been a single object, but part of a sequence, a path like stepping stones, each marked by signs, residual heat, electromagnetic shifts, silent detours in the night. And always the same pattern: arrive, recover, erase. By the end of the meeting, only 2 decisions were made. First, the vial of altered soil would be split and hidden in separate containers, each given to a different participant. Second, Reeves, whose authority was never questioned but always sensed, gave a final instruction. "If you're approached," he said, "deny this meeting, deny each other. Forget the names, forget what you saw. If they ask about me, tell them I never existed." The warehouse was emptied by dawn. That same week, local radio station KBRL received a shortwave transmission intercepted during a routine frequency scan. It lasted only 18 seconds. Analysts later said the signal was not human. A linguist from Albuquerque, who attempted to chart the modulation pattern, disappeared in late December. His notes were confiscated by unknown agents claiming to represent a federal broadcast safety division. No such division existed in government directories of that year. And through it all, the names of the missing grew longer, the conversations shorter, files vanished, letters never arrived. Those who asked too many questions were quietly removed, some by force, others by silence. By the time winter settled over the plains, Roswell was no longer a town with a secret. It was a town that had been emptied of truth. By January of 1948, Roswell had grown quieter still. The seasonal cold gave the illusion that silence was natural, but underneath there was an absence that could not be explained by snow or frost. Streets were emptier in the early hours. Telephone operators reported calls that dropped into static. The local postmaster began to notice mail sacks arriving already opened, contents resealed poorly, like someone was rushing through letters, searching for a specific name or a phrase. The year turned, but the events of the previous summer had left their stain. In late January, a new thread emerged. A man calling himself Dr. Henry Bell arrived in New Mexico under the auspices of the National Geological Survey, but his credentials didn't check out. The listed university he claimed to represent, Darnell Polytechnic, had closed during the Depression. Still, he carried official government forms, signed with real Department of Interior signatures. No one questioned him too long. Bell began traveling between towns near the original crash site, not Roswell itself, but farther north, toward Vaughan and Corona. He posed as an academic gathering seismic readings, but his true work centered on interviewing witnesses from July of the previous year. Among those he found was a shepherd, Miguel Alcaraz, who had been grazing his flock on federal grazing lands on July 6th. His account was unremarkable at first. A loud crack in the sky, a momentary burst of white light, and silence. But Miguel kept a notebook. In it were crude symbols, copied by hand from a fragment he claimed to have found embedded in a rock. He had kept it hidden inside a hollowed-out wall of his adobe shelter. When Bell retrieved the fragment, he immediately contacted a man named Charles Lyman in Alamogordo, a former physicist with experience in radar materials. Lyman analyzed the fragment and concluded, based on surface diffraction, that it had been engineered using a fabrication technique beyond the capabilities of any known mill or foundry at the time. The fragment appeared metallic but was soft to the touch. Weightless in hand, when heated, it retained a perfect shape. The surface was etched, almost at the microscopic level, with markings that resembled neither letters nor numerals. Lyman described them as programmatic runes, not language in the usual sense, but instructional in intent, like something meant to be interpreted by a machine. This material was never turned over to authorities. Weeks later, both Bell and Lyman vanished. Bell's car was found abandoned in a canyon outside Carrizozo. His satchel was inside, but the fragment was not. Lyman's home had been stripped clean. Even the wallpaper had been peeled away. The pattern deepened. Meanwhile, back in Roswell, two workers at the local mortuary, Matthew Cole and his assistant Lenora Fritz, began to speak discreetly about an event that had haunted them for months. In July of the previous year, they had been called late at night by personnel from the airfield. A request was made, urgently and off the books, for several child-sized coffins, sealed. No names were given. No official records exist of any deaths requiring such arrangements at that time. Fritz, driven by curiosity, later asked one of the military drivers what had happened. The man looked pale, unshaven, and smelled faintly of ether. He answered in a whisper, "We're burying something. That ain't ours. By February, whispers reached the ear of Eleanor Prentice, a nurse at St. Mary's Medical in Albuquerque. She had treated a patient brought in from the Eastern Plains, a man whose skin bore burns that pulsed under the surface, as though light was trapped beneath. The man spoke in riddles. He mentioned doors in the desert and the corridor of fire. Before she could report the case to the county health office, military personnel arrived, declared the patient's case classified, and relocated him. The next day, Eleanor was placed on indefinite leave. Others who had brushed close to the incident began to suffer too. John Reeve, a former Army intelligence officer stationed at Roswell, was found dead in his apartment in March. His body was discovered with fingernails torn, deep grooves along the walls, signs of panic or something else. A single sheet of paper was taped to his mirror. It read, "They see through time." His death was ruled a suicide. His family disputed the claim. Around this time, an anonymous package was delivered to the offices of the El Paso Sentinel. Inside was a reel of 16mm film and a handwritten note that read only, "Projection Room 3. The footage, later viewed under supervision, showed aerial reconnaissance shots dated July 10, 1947, taken over an area 25 kilometers east of Roswell. The landscape was scorched in a precise geometric pattern, not the result of fire or impact. The burns formed arcs, circles within circles, as if something had rotated or pulsed energy outward in regulated fashion. The footage also showed figures, barely distinguishable, moving around the perimeter, dressed in light-colored environmental suits. The suits did not match any known military design from the time. The newspaper did not publish the film. 2 days later, their projectionist disappeared en route home. His vehicle was found overturned on a dirt road. No signs of injury. The film vanished from evidence storage shortly after. In April, a group of university students from Santa Fe, inspired by rumors, went on an unsanctioned expedition toward the old crash perimeter. What they found there was not wreckage or debris, but silence. Birds refused to fly overhead. Their compasses spun erratically. The youngest of the group, a geology student named Owen Harker, began complaining of ringing in his ears, followed by hallucinations. He claimed to see a tower of metal rising from the earth, spinning without noise. The group fled. Harker never recovered. He was committed by summer. Reports continued to stack. Testimonies, photographs, strange health records, audio tapes that played back whispers under layers of static. But each time something surfaced, it vanished just as quickly. People began to talk less, even in private. Fear did not come from knowing what had happened. It came from the certainty that someone else knew and was listening. By late spring, Roswell was no longer the focal point. Whatever had happened was no longer there. The scar in the earth remained, faint but visible. But the presence, whatever it had been, had moved on. And yet, there were patterns. Timelines, names that kept reappearing across incident reports. Engineers who had once worked at Wright Field. Medical personnel with experience in biological containment. Civilian researchers who disappeared from history. A matrix of silence built across the continent, from White Sands to Fort Worth. Each connection traced to that week in July. But the line did not stop there. There were earlier entries. Sightings in the 30s, naval records from the 40s, even private telegrams from foreign embassies, all pointing to something that had been circling humanity longer than anyone cared to admit. But the pattern was always the same. Arrival, contact, erasure, and behind it all, a silence so total, so deliberately orchestrated, it became louder than any testimony ever could. The summer of 1948 came without ceremony. In Roswell, the desert heat returned, baking the sand into cracked sheets and drawing mirages on the distant horizon. The town's surface resumed its routine, mail routes, school closures, county fair preparations, but beneath it, the fractures deepened. By June, rumors began surfacing from the northern reaches of New Mexico, near the edge of Lincoln County. Ranchers reported night disturbances, low vibrations in the soil, animals acting erratically, and a pulsing light seen beyond the hills. Some blamed smugglers, others lingering military exercises, but there were no records of maneuvers that summer. What the ranchers described bore an uncanny resemblance to reports from the previous July, prior to the crash. One incident stood apart. On the night of June 14th, at the abandoned mining outpost of Carrara's Hollow, 3 surveyors from a regional water commission vanished without a trace. Their last recorded location placed them just outside the main tunnel shaft. A 4th man, Thomas Brandt, returned alone, disheveled, bruised, and partially blind in one eye. His testimony was brief, disjointed, and peppered with moments of what the doctors described as involuntary stillness, periods where he stared blankly, as if listening to something inaudible. When questioned, Brandt recalled a hum, not sound, but a feeling in his bones, followed by the appearance of impossible angles in the air. He claimed the light bent wrong, that it folded space and his colleagues were taken into it like fish pulled from a pond. The shaft was sealed within 24 hours by federal workers citing geological instability. The area was placed under restricted access for safety assessment. No bodies were recovered. In early July, a letter surfaced in Las Cruces. Sent anonymously to the editor of a minor local newspaper, it contained coordinates, a name, Avery V. Croft, and one line scrawled in pencil: second impact never recovered. The coordinates pointed to a stretch of scrubland southeast of Capitan. When a private investigator, Willis Herndon, followed the lead, he discovered evidence of a controlled excavation. The earth had been disturbed in a nearly perfect ellipse, 13 meters across. Buried in the center, under layers of soot and rock, were melted fragments of a ceramic-metallic hybrid, glass-like on one side, coiled with carbonized fibers on the other. Herndon took photographs, catalogued samples, and left. He never made it back to Las Cruces. His car was discovered overturned near Socorro, trunk emptied, camera missing. The negatives were never found. Around this time, former radar operator Gerald Ames, discharged under ambiguous conditions in August of '47, began keeping a series of private tapes. In these, recovered decades later, Ames described unexplained radar echoes logged on the night of July 6th. The patterns formed a triangle, stable and hovering, over a 30-minute period. The readings were dismissed by command as instrument error. But Ames noted something else: a spike in frequency drift just before the echoes vanished. A signal that bent standard calibration dials by over 30%, enough to fry the system. The language he used in the recordings grew more frantic with each session. By the final tape, dated August 1st, he claimed the echoes were not machines but observers, and that one of them didn't leave. The implications were dismissed, even mocked, until a month later when Ames was found in his home, eyes burned white, electrical burns on both palms, as if he had gripped a live power line. No line was found. Parallel to these events, private aviation reports grew strange. A pilot named Lawrence Pierce, flying a mail route from Fort Sumner to Hobbs, recorded a close encounter on July 9th. At 2300 hours, Pierce's aircraft stalled mid-flight, all dials dead. For 6 minutes he drifted, powerless, as a sphere of light paced his right wingtip at identical speed and altitude. No visible structure, no sound. When power returned, the sphere vanished in an instant. Upon landing, Pierce was taken aside by military personnel and instructed not to file a report. He complied, but shared his story with a close friend, Harold Vess, a ham radio operator. Vess began tracking strange transmissions across emergency bands, matching time frames to known flight anomalies. He eventually isolated a repeating pattern, pulses at intervals of 7.5 seconds, coded in groups of 4. Morse code specialists couldn't translate it. It did not match any language or known cipher. By midsummer, Vess's radio tower was struck by lightning. Despite clear skies, his equipment burned. He relocated. The pattern never returned. It was around this time that the name Croft resurfaced. Avery V. Croft, according to sparse Army records, had been a technical advisor on Project Hermes, an early post-war missile development effort, but Croft had been discharged without commendation in early '46, and rumors hinted at disciplinary action. Then, in July of '47, he reappeared, this time listed as a consultant liaison on internal memos involving containment procedures at Roswell Army Airfield. He wasn't military, he wasn't civilian, he was something in between. Documents leaked into the fall of '48, hand-carried by a former adjutant in Los Alamos, referenced Croft by codename Spectre. In the margins, someone had written, "Non-aligned asset, third-party authorization." Croft's role, according to the notes, involved post-recovery sterilization and neurological interface tests. These were not terms used in standard operating procedures of the time. Medical officers listed alongside his name, Dr. Isaac Nivens and Lieutenant Lyle Forrester, died months later in separate vehicular incidents. Their personal papers were confiscated. Only one man, Chief Medical Warrant Joseph Caro, left a record. A journal, coded but deciphered years later, revealed troubling entries. Diagrams of elongated skulls, not human in proportion, mentions of biological specimens kept under refrigeration, and, most disturbing, autopsy sketches that matched no known physiology. In the final entry, Caro wrote, "They didn't die in the crash. They were dying when they arrived. Their craft was a coffin. We opened it anyway." Weeks later, he was institutionalized for severe psychological collapse. Yet even as witnesses were silenced and artifacts disappeared, new evidence slipped through the cracks. A farm worker in Dexter found an item in late August buried near a dried-out arroyo. A disc the size of a man's hand, cold to the touch, humming faintly. He took it to the sheriff. By the next morning, the sheriff's office was emptied. Furniture overturned. The disc gone. The farm worker was found weeks later wandering outside Clovis, naked and unable to speak. His tongue had been cut out. These were not isolated events. They formed a net, deliberate, calculated, merciless. And woven into that net were names, coordinates, fragments of metal and memory, all converging toward one conclusion. Whatever crashed in the desert outside Roswell had not been destroyed. It had been retrieved, and someone, not military, not government, was deciding who lived with that knowledge and who didn't. Autumn came to New Mexico with a deceptive calm. The desert winds softened and the nights lengthened into stillness. The skies cleared to that polished glass hue that made the stars seem closer than ever. But beneath the open expanse, something tightened. A pressure not seen, not named, but felt. In the marrow, in the silence between questions left unanswered. By September of 1948, a new figure emerged in the trail of buried reports and censored testimonies. Dr. Alton R. Keene, formerly of the Army Medical Corps. Though publicly retired, Keene had been consulting in a private capacity for a firm called Relion Materials, a company with no storefront, no public record of employees, and a mailing address linked to a post office box in Alamogordo. Relion appeared nowhere in business registries prior to July of '47. By August, it was named in at least 3 redacted procurement requests related to extraterrestrial composites testing. The term wasn't used openly, of course. The documents referred instead to non-conventional metallurgical anomalies and organic synthetic interface samples. Keene's personal notes, later recovered by a relative in San Bernardino, contained far more disturbing language. He described working with what he called bioconductive filament, grown rather than manufactured, and fragments of something he labeled resonant bone, a structure capable of transmitting signal across multiple frequencies depending on stress applied to its surface. His sketches showed ribbed, branch-like materials, vascular in shape, embedded with fine metallic threads. But it was his description of an object recovered from Site 2 that raised the greatest alarm. According to Keane, the object, an ovoid pod the size of a child's torso, responded to human proximity. When touched, its surface warmed. When approached by multiple people, it pulsed rhythmically. One technician, Walter Sims, claimed to hear whispers when standing beside it for prolonged periods. Sims died 10 days later of an aggressive cerebral hemorrhage. Keane stopped writing entries after October the 10th. That same month, Reliant Materials was quietly absorbed into a larger holding company, Meriden Instruments, which itself dissolved before year's end. No known assets were transferred. Keane was never heard from again. The pattern of disappearance, redirection, and silence repeated with terrifying consistency. Each witness, each scrap of tangible truth was countered by layers of doubt and bureaucratic mud. But in the winter of '48, a crack appeared in the machinery. A former civil engineer named Bennett Ray, recently dismissed from a subcontractor role at Los Alamos, mailed a package to a newspaper office in Wichita. Inside were field sketches, topographical maps, and carbon-copied field reports referencing an anomalous energy gradient recorded in a grid sector northwest of Roswell. The gradient matched the terrain where earlier excavations had been sealed and buried. More alarming were the entries that followed. Frequent auditory hallucinations reported by survey team, navigation systems corrupted within perimeter, and disorientation resembling mild temporal displacement. The phrase was unusual. Temporal displacement had no formal meaning in engineering circles at the time, but its inclusion sparked quiet attention from academics in Chicago and Boston who had, in unrelated papers, observed microtime anomalies in high-voltage test chambers during early particle acceleration experiments. These notes never made it to public journals. One of the physicists, Dr. Hugo Matheson, vanished in December. His last correspondence hinted at a convergence point, something not ours, not theirs, but in between. Meanwhile, in Roswell, the quiet became heavier. Locals reported seeing unmarked trucks moving through the outskirts at night, headlights off, their tires leaving deep, symmetrical grooves in the sand. One resident, Dolores Franks, awoke one night to the sound of humming beneath her floorboards. Her home stood 20 miles from any power station. When she investigated, she found a blackened depression in her backyard, perfectly circular, its soil fused into a glassy sheen. The next morning, men in dark coveralls arrived. They said they were from the state utility office. They asked no questions. They took the entire patch of soil and left. Franks told her story only once, to a neighbor's cousin who worked in Las Vegas and had a habit of recording everything. That tape was played only once on a pirate station out of Taos before the frequency went dead. The broadcaster, known as Jeb, was arrested for unrelated charges 3 days later. No copy of the tape remains. A new tension coiled within the military as well. A declassified memo, dated November the 9th, mentioned rising discontent among lower-level airmen at Roswell AAF. Whispers of something alive in cold storage, a recovered being or object still functioning in ways unexplained. One technician claimed to hear faint breathing near the sealed containment unit. Others reported dreams, synchronized and recurring. A desert, a black star falling from the sky, a voice behind the sun. In response, Command issued what was referred to as a quietive protocol, a temporary personnel redistribution masked as leave rotations. Those who exhibited signs of cognitive disruption were sent away indefinitely. No one returned. One airman, Corporal James Weller, attempted to smuggle a photo out, an X-ray of what he claimed was the unrecovered occupant. The image showed a thin, elongated skull with 2 primary cranial chambers and what appeared to be embedded coils in the spinal column. Weller was caught before boarding a train to Kansas. The photograph was never shown to the press, but years later, a hand-drawn reproduction surfaced in an anonymous manuscript titled The Fourth Corridor. The manuscript also contained descriptions of 2 events that had gone unreported elsewhere, one involving a power outage at the Sandia test range following an attempt to re-energize a recovered fragment. The other, far more troubling, was the death of a linguist brought in to decode patterns from an etched alloy surface. According to the document, the linguist carved strange glyphs into the walls of his quarters before throwing himself from a sixth-floor window. The glyphs matched no known script. They have never been translated. By December of 1948, two things had become clear to those following the traces. First, the object that fell in Roswell was not alone. It was part of something larger, a system, a process, or perhaps a signal chain. And second, what had been taken from the wreckage was not merely physical. It was changing those who came near it. Not through radiation or infection, but something subtler. Thought, dream, memory. Roswell had become a place of silence, not because there was nothing left to find, but because too many had found too much. The desert had given up its secret once, and it was not finished. By early January of 1949, Roswell no longer slept. The town went on. School teachers arrived each morning. Stores opened their doors. The courthouse rang its daily bell. But an unease had settled into the bones of the land. Not fear, exactly. Not anymore. Something older than fear. A knowing. An understanding too deep to speak aloud. On the fringes of the official narrative, in the corners of half-burned documents and altered death records, a final layer began to form. A latticework of final testimonies, ghost memos, and whispered names. Not all had disappeared. A few had chosen to stay behind, fading into obscurity rather than risk the attention of whatever forces were pulling the strings behind sealed hangars and blank-badged men. One of them was Corporal Lowell Givens, formerly assigned to the Logistics Division at Walker Field. In mid-February, under the cover of a winter storm, he approached a retired radio technician, Dennis Calloway, in Klein's Corners. Givens spoke only once, for less than half an hour, then handed over a single envelope. Inside were two black and white photographs and a note written in faint pencil. They took what they thought was wreckage. But it wasn't wreckage. It was a door. The photos, long since faded, showed a rounded structure embedded in bedrock, a sort of arch or threshold, not large enough for a man to walk through. The surface shimmered strangely, even in grayscale. Etchings lined its curve, resembling no tool marks known at the time. The second photo captured a technician with a lead-lined glove reaching toward it. His hand was inches away. The photo was the last time that technician, Private First Class Roland Brewer, was seen. Calloway, fearing for his life, buried the envelope behind the foundation of his home. It was uncovered by his grandson in the summer of 2006, after decades of rumors and silence. But by then, every name on the documents had long since vanished or been declared dead. And yet, not all threads had been severed. A woman named Ruth Enfield, once a linguist with the Signal Corps, had left behind a diary. Coded, difficult to verify, but aligned with too many details to dismiss. Her last entries describe a project she was assigned to at Fort Hood in late 1948. Project Novus, allegedly a decoding effort. But the symbols she was given did not belong to any language known to man. "They are impressions," she wrote, not written by hand, not even carved, as if they appeared in the surface, like thoughts pressed into metal. Enfield claimed that when viewed under low light conditions, the symbols appeared to shift. One glyph, shaped like an open spiral, induced nausea when stared at for longer than several seconds. Another, resembling an angular eye, appeared in the dreams of 3 separate analysts within the same week. 2 resigned. 1 took his own life. The diary ends with a final phrase repeated 7 times across the last page. They are not messages, they are instructions. Across the country in rural Colorado, an old mechanic named Saul Darnell died of a heart attack in March of '49. He was cremated within 24 hours, no autopsy. Darnell had once worked at Wright Field, in the very hangar where the Roswell materials were transferred in July of '47. Before his death, he told a neighbor something strange, that he had seen a sphere that bled, He described a semi-translucent orb filled with a thick, oil-like substance that reacted to touch. He claimed that when exposed to light, veins appeared inside it, like a circulatory system. He said it made a low humming, not with sound, but in the head. He was told to forget what he saw. He never did. By spring, files marked as irrelevant or mistakenly archived began disappearing from regional depositories. Microfilms scratched, boxes gone, names no longer indexed. The operation, whatever it had become, was no longer containment. It was erasure. And erasure, as it always does, left behind a deeper curiosity. One final document, known only as the Prescott Memo, surfaced in a university archive in Illinois. It had been misfiled under meteorological phenomena. It contained no names, no locations, only a typewritten summary of an event consistent with atmospheric entry followed by adaptive trajectory deviation. The document concluded, "Not all artifacts originate from outside. Some are calls to what lies dormant within." Those who reviewed the file dismissed it as abstract nonsense. Perhaps philosophical musings by a scientist on the brink. But the date caught attention, July 4th, 1947. 3 days before the Roswell crash. And so the story closed where it began, in silence. The craft was never publicly confirmed. The second impact site was swallowed by time, wind, and the careful hand of authority. Witnesses died or vanished, names faded from memory, companies dissolved, projects buried under new acronyms. But even today, there are places in the desert where radios crackle without source, where time bends slightly, where silence grows dense and sharp. In the folds of those forgotten places, the air still remembers. The door was opened, and nothing ever said it had been closed.